Welcome to our next nerd session. I feel like we needed some intro music here to liven things up a little bit. Today we're going to be talking about the book of Philippians. Of all of Paul's books, Philippians is oftentimes a lot of people's favorites, and so I thought we'd start with my favorite group of Avengers, the Guardians of the Galaxy, and one of their theme songs. Do miss the Guardians of the Galaxy. Hopefully they'll be back soon. All right. So here's our key concepts. You can read through them as usual. Here's our background information here. Now, sometimes the background information is kind of helpful and it helps us sort through a couple of things, but more often than not, well, maybe not more often than not, but sometimes it can be a little bit obscure in connecting the background to some passages here. With the book of Philippians, though, I want you to understand that the background information is absolutely essential to understanding this particular book. And the key background information you need to know is that the city of Philippi, when I'm looking at bullet point 2 here, is that the city of Philippi is a Roman colony populated extensively by military veterans. Now, why does that matter? Well, the reason why that matters is that, as I think I've mentioned before, not everybody in the ancient world, in the Roman Empire, is a citizen of the Roman Empire. Everybody's a resident, but not everybody has the full privileges and rights of citizenship. So, why does that matter? Well, how do you get citizenship in the Roman world? One of the key ways you do that is by military service. Since the city of Philippi is basically a retirement home for military veterans, most everybody who lives there is either a military veteran or a descendant of a military veteran, which means that it's safe for us to say that almost, we don't know what the exact percentage is, but it's safe to say that a vast majority of the people who are living in Philippi are Roman citizens, and that makes them stand out compared to most people who live in the Roman Empire and stand out compared to most other cities in the Roman Empire. And that will be absolutely essential to us understanding what Paul is trying to develop here in this book. So that leads then into our theme, which is going to be Christian citizenship. Just as Paul's writing to a group of Roman citizens, he's going to teach them about the concept of citizenship and also humility. Now, I will say this to make your lives a little bit easier here. The definitive theme for Philippians that you would find on the test is going to be humility. I won't make you guess whether you need to know Christian citizenship, humility, or both. What I want you to know for the test is the definitive theme of Philippians is humility. So in chapter 1, Paul's going to give us a very long introduction where he says the Philippians are awesome and good for them, all those kinds of fun things. And then he says that he tells the Philippians he's in jail when he's writing this. And when you're in jail, you don't know what, in the ancient world, you really don't know what's going to happen to you. And so there's a distinct possibility Paul is in the end days of his life. And maybe he was when he wrote this, maybe he wasn't. We don't know because there's a couple of different points in Paul's life where he was in jail, and so we can't know exactly when he wrote this letter. But he expresses that if he's about to die, he's happy for that because he will be with Christ. But if he's not going to die, that's okay too because he's willing to persevere in his work. And then he transitions on and says, I don't want you guys to think that I don't understand that you guys have suffered too. Just as I have suffered, you have suffered as well. And then we transition over into chapter 2, where he's going to deal with the suffering where he's going to begin to discuss the suffering they've encountered and how to deal with that. Now, in a lot of ways, the line of thought that Paul's going to develop in chapter 3 really begins in chapter 1, verse 27. And I want you to pay attention to the first sub-bullet point here, where I've written out the verse for you, and it says, where Paul says, only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. Now that's a fine translation. It's a reasonable translation. But if we were to take this translation a little bit more literally, what we would see in the original Greek would be Paul proclaiming, be worthy citizens of the gospel of Christ. And when Paul uses that word citizens to an audience full of Roman citizens, that's the kind of word that makes your ears perk up a little bit and makes you pay just a little bit more attention. It's as though I were to call out somebody's name right. So, Melanie, do your ears perk up a little bit when I call you out here? Emma? Adam? Kylie? Probably a lot of you were like, who are these people? Because some of them are not from your class necessarily. But hopefully that gives you an example there of if somebody suddenly calls on your name and you're only sort of halfway listening because you're still thinking about when the next Guardians of the Galaxy movie is going to be coming out, that will cause you to sit up a little bit straighter and start taking a little bit better notes. And that's what Paul's doing here when he uses that word citizen. And so from that moment on, I think the Philippians are going to say, okay, you have my attention, Paul. What's on your mind here? And so he's going to teach the Philippians to be good or worthy citizens of the gospel of Christ. Well, what does that mean for them? Well, he's going to explain that to them a couple of verses later. Philippians 2, verse 3. Do nothing from selfishness or conceit, but in humility count others better than yourselves. Okay, sounds good, simple, straightforward. How do we know this is what we're supposed to do? That brings us to Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11. This is what we refer to as an early Christian hymn. In most of your Bibles, it will be written in lyrical or poetic form. It will not be written in prose form. That's because most scholars are in agreement that that these verses were an early hymn, a song that the early Christians would have sung, and Paul is quoting it here as a way of proving his point to the Philippians. What I'd like you to take away from this slide is that I want you to know how we know what early Christians sang or how we know early Christian hymns existed. And it's the third bullet. The answer is the third bullet point here, which is the hymns are preserved in the letters of the New Testament. And I've given you many examples there. Now let's get to the hymn itself. This is an important passage to me because part of my dissertation was based on this verse here or was built around these verses here. So I apologize if I drone on a little bit with these verses. We should go, well, I'll trust you guys to read these on your own, to read these verses on your own. If you haven't done so, pause the video and do so now. Now, what I want you to understand about this is there are a couple of different ways of interpreting this particular hymn. One possible way of interpreting it is to say that The opening verses where Paul says that Jesus was in the form of God, that he is saying that Jesus is equal to God, and that's another way of expressing something very similar to what John expressed in John chapter 1, that Jesus was God. And so the hymn begins by expressing that Jesus was in the form of God, but then he descends to be a slave. And then because of his obedience and humility, God exalted him, and he returned to his form, or he returned to the glory of God the Father. It says in verse 11. And so, simply put, this hymn could be about the story of the incarnation of Jesus, as I've listed on the fourth big bullet point here. Now, this is where I'm going to drone on and tell you a little bit about my dissertation. Occasionally, you may hear people, especially if you read Time magazine, or at least look at the cover of Time magazine around Easter or Christmas, there will be articles that dispute whether or not Jesus was God, and there will be articles that will suggest that Christians invented the deity of Jesus or the divinity of Jesus and said that Jesus wasn't actually, and that Jesus never actually claimed to be God, and that early Christians forced that idea upon him. I would strongly disagree with that, and Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 11 is a good expression of why. Because if this is in fact a hymn, and Paul is quoting it as something that the Philippians would have been familiar with, as a proof text, then that means that this is something that was written very early on in the history of Christianity. And so the significance to church history here is that we are quite possibly looking at the oldest scrap of Christian writing ever. Now, to clarify that, I told you in the first nerd session that 1 Thessalonians is the first book of the New Testament to be written. But this little snippet, these 5-6 verses here, are possibly the very first verses of the New Testament ever composed. And they were written originally as a hymn. And so what they show us is that from a very early time in Christian history, within a few years, probably less than a decade of Jesus' resurrection, we have clear evidence that Christians were worshiping Jesus as God. Okay, that's way more than I needed to, that's more than I should have gotten into there. All right, now moving back up here, going back to the third main bullet point, and now looking at the second of those sub-bullet points there, where I talk about, was there an opportunity for temptation similar to that of Genesis 3:5? Christ is the second Adam. I have not written that very well, and I apologize for that. I probably need to rewrite this PowerPoint. The second interpretation of this hymn that I want you to be aware of is that this hymn may be primarily expressing or describing the humility of Jesus, and that may be the main point of it. Notice how it starts off by talking about how Jesus was in an extremely exalted state in the form of God, but he then empties himself, lowers himself to become the form of a slave. That's a pretty humiliating position. And because he humbled himself and became human, and he became the lowest of all humans by being crucified on a cross, God exalted him highly above every name. And so what this hymn is describing for the Philippians is the intense humility of Christ. And when he does that, when Christ acts in this supremely humble way, he does something special for humanity. What he does is and I want you to pay attention to what I'm going to say next here, because this is going to be on the test here. This is the key to the second interpretation. He undoes the prideful first sin of humanity. And what I mean by that is if you go back to Genesis chapter 3, which is the story of the first sin of humans in the Garden of Eden, Eve, who is the first woman, is tempted to eat a piece of fruit by a snake. And the reason why she does that, according to Genesis chapter 3, is that she desired to be like God. We might say that the desire to be like God is the ultimate form of pride. And so Jesus, although he was already in the form of God, decided, being God's not that special. Unlike Eve, who thought being God was all there was to life, Jesus descends and becomes human, accepting a creaturely status, which Eve rejected. And so by being supremely humble, he undoes the prideful first sin of humanity for us. And so the Philippians are instructed through this hymn to be like Jesus, who is the ultimate example of humility for us. The defining characteristic of Jesus, according to this hymn, is humility. And if Christians are to be citizens, if we are to be citizens of Christ, then should we not emulate Christ, who therefore is the ultimate example of humility? So to fully emulate Christ is to be humble. That is the defining characteristic of Christian citizenship, according to Paul. Okay, I spent a lot of time on this slide. Let me recap. There are two interpretations I want you to be aware of. One, it expresses how Jesus became incarnate, and thus shows us that from a very early time period, early Christians worship Jesus as God. Second interpretation, it shows us how Jesus undoes the prideful first sin of humanity. And so, what are we supposed to take away from this? The ultimate expression of Christianity, or of following Christ, is to be a humble person. All right, let's keep going. Okay, so moving on through the rest of Philippians chapter 2, there's a lot of interesting ideas that we could develop here. Philippians 2:12 has this interesting passage where Paul talks about the necessity of working out your own salvation with fear and trembling. What exactly does he mean by that? I would simply say that what Paul seems to be expressing here is that the idea of this very simplified understanding of salvation that sometimes American Christians get of pray one simple prayer and you're good to go for the rest of your life is a very simplistic understanding of Paul's emphasis on faith. And so Paul, I think, is simply trying to express that salvation is something that is worthy of deep commitment here. There's a lot more we could say here, but we'll cover more of these kinds of issues when we get to Galatians. And Philippians 3 is another example of where we will cover stuff, where we'll cover more details in the book of Galatians. He talks about workers of evil who mutilate the flesh, and he is concerned about the issue. He's concerned about the issue of circumcision here. Really, all I want you to be aware of here is that the issue we will talk about in the book of Galatians next time is not an issue that is limited just to Galatians. The issue of the value of circumcision was something that Paul was concerned about in many of his various letters, and what it represents. And what circumcision represents, as again we'll talk about more detail in Galatians, is your standing before God and whether or not you need to be obedient to the law or not, and whether obeying the law is of value and gives you any sort of special standing before God. And Paul is going to reject that idea here in Philippians 3 and in far more detail in the book of Galatians. And so he emphasizes the idea that we should not be prideful of wearing these Jewish marks. Instead, what should we ultimately take pride in? Our citizenship, which is in heaven. So humility for Paul is not necessarily means you can never be proud of something. It's about being proud of the right things, and it's being proud of your faithfulness in Christ, to Christ, and if you are being obedient to Christ, then you will be humble, and it's okay to be proud of the fact that you are a follower of Christ. There's nothing wrong with that in his eyes, so long as it's not boastful. Then chapter 4, he encourages Euodia and Syntyche. They were co-workers of Paul's, to stop fighting and fussing with each other. And it's possible the issue they may have had was that one of them just wasn't being humble enough. And if that's the case, that would give this book a little bit of thematic unity. We can't know for certain whether that is, but it's certainly a distinct possibility. All right. That wraps up the book of Philippians for us. This one is short, sweet, and to the point. I kept this close to my 20-minute goal here. When we talk about Galatians, we'll spend a lot more time on those issues of Jewish pride and circumcision. So I will see you at the next nerd session then.